Okay, cool. Hi guys. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Want you to know that this is the second virtual meetup that we've done with Forge. So if we do anything bad, let us know. The last one we did the same setup with Zoom and the moderated Slack, and that worked out really well for both the presenter and everyone attending. So I hope that it does the same thing today. We're really excited to be able to accommodate virtual meetups. I just want to remind everyone that like normal, I am recording this. We're going to be putting it on YouTube. Unlike normal, we don't have everybody in the same room together. So just for the quality of the recording and so that we don't catch anything unexpected, please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras unless you're Carlos. He needs to not be muted. And he can turn on his camera if he so desires for us to record his beautiful face. But that's just for the quality of the recording. We are investigating other methods of having remote meetings, but Zoom is what we've been using for a while to accommodate remote. So we're going to continue doing it, and we're thankful for the gracious sponsorship of Weave to provide this Zoom platform. We don't have really a whole bunch of announcements along with the meetups besides I don't have a speaker for next month. So if anybody wants to talk, we're going to continue the online format until Weave is no longer a remote company. So let me know. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Carlos so he can introduce himself and present.
Great, thank you, Mariah. And it is a little different to be able to present like this. So hopefully the Q&A, that we can keep it a conversation. So I'm going to do my best to do that instead of just a presentation. Obviously, my thoughts as I was preparing this, it's atypical, right? But my thoughts are with everybody and their families. You know, it's unfortunate what's happening with the virus, but I think we maintain optimism and we move forward. But at the same time, I'm excited to present things that we're hopefully very passionate. We share the same passion for in being able to solve data science project failures. And you know, as I was preparing for this, I figured it would be something that, while it's high level and business more than it is technical, that we might be able to explore that towards the end of the conversation. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of nuggets here, hopefully, that everyone can use and that we can think about. Just as by way of introduction, my name is Carlos Kemeny. I'm the director of BI and data science at Weave. I grew up in Indiana and moved out to Utah maybe about 2.5 years ago. I worked at Domo prior to joining Weave as a principal consultant there, working with the large enterprises that signed up for Domo and worked with them from post-sale all the way to infinity, and worked primarily in the financial and healthcare industries, but explored other industries as well while I was there, and really have become quite passionate around the psychology of data science projects and BI in general. I'm a big advocate for the culture, the data culture, and I know that all of us are incredibly important and critical in our community in being able to build up BI and data science across the state of Utah and across our industries. And so the spirit of this discussion and this presentation is that we can help one another to create a future for data science success, and that we can leverage some of these strategies, and that we can build upon strategies that I don't even know the answers that we need to solve, or the problems that we need to solve and the answers therein. And so I'm hopeful that we can take this conversation further and figure out strategies that we can deploy across all of our companies and across the state of Utah. So with that, I'm going to start with the answer. My suggested answer to the problem of how do we solve the data science project failure problem, and that is simplicity. I think there's great beauty in simplicity, and this is my mantra for 2020. It's to be as simple as possible. One of the things that I love about simplicity is that there is elegance and difficulty in attaining it. In fact, in a notable 1933 lecture, Einstein said it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. I like this a lot. I like that the idea here is that, well, we don't want to surrender at all the representation of a single data point. There's something about being able to reduce something to its most simplistic form. And that can be a goal of everything that we do. And I think that as we dive in to mainly a recommended or a process, a framework that I've created, obviously each of you has gone down the path of creating different frameworks, I believe. And in so doing, there is a lot of thought to the theory of creating data science success. And so the common objective that I hope, and the objective that I suggest to all of you, is that take those theories, take all of those data points, and create something that's simple and beautiful. So, of course, when we think about simplicity, Apple comes to mind. And in fact, the first mouse that was developed, Apple had asked IDEO to develop a mouse, and they needed to do it in a way that was beautiful, but in a way that was cost effective. And the challenge that they were given was to create a new kind of computer navigation device that was less expensive and more reliable than any other one on the market at that time. And so they went ahead and did that. And they had lots of expertise that was going into developing at Apple through Xerox when they were trying to create this navigation device. And that's when they brought in IDEO. And the resulting mouse was something of beauty, and it was something simple, but it achieved all of those objectives. And so ultimately, this idea of simplicity and innovation, while these things are shown in products, in the real world, the idea here in terms of process and the way that we communicate data science, all of these things can also be simple. And so that's really the theme of this talk, is how do we create simplicity to solve this problem. So I'm not going to get into all of the reasons specifically as to why there are so many articles, and there's tons of articles. Here's some clips of these articles of why data science projects fail. Certainly that could be a science experiment unto itself. I liked actually the after you have the 6 or the 10 or the top 3, I liked that one stood out, the top 32 reasons why data science projects and teams fail. I think that that's brilliant. And of course, we might be able to come up with another article for the top 100 reasons. But all of these articles, I think, are interesting in that they share common data points as to why data science projects fail. Included in those are these listed: asking the wrong questions, benefits don't justify the costs, data problems. And I'm sure that each of us can nod our heads to probably one of these that hits. I like that back in 2018, there was a conference, and Chris Chapo, a senior VP of data and analytics at Gap, he was talking about early data science projects at Gap, and it was talking about how a few years ago, the team handed an algorithm to an engineer, and it got recorded and implemented. And then just a few weeks later, that they realized after using this this algorithm that it had been broken for 3.5 years because nobody owned it. They didn't have a data science team to work on it. And so, obviously from a standpoint of lack of collaboration or silos, we've seen and we've been through those different battles and trying to overcome these. So I think that we all can find at least some solace, and that we've all had to deal with similar problems with regards to why data science projects fail. Here are a few more, and I like this from the New Vantage Partners survey. This is back in 2017. But big data technology is not the problem. Management understanding, organizational alignment, and general organizational resistance are the culprits. If only people were as malleable as data. So not only are they technical challenges, but they are people challenges, and oftentimes that becomes the most challenging part. Yet another one, and I think this is actually a seminal article for all data science professionals, the HBR article in February of 2019, Data Science and the Art of Persuasion. I love this article, and I would recommend everybody to read it and to study it. But there's a portion there where the author writes, in a question on Kaggle's 2017 survey of data scientists, 4 of the top 7 barriers faced at work were related to last mile issues, not technical ones. Lack of management financial support, lack of clear questions to answer, results not used by decision makers, and explaining data science to others. So again, whether that's last mile or whether they're technical issues or all of the above, there is no question that there are a number of different data science failure reasons. And so the question is, which one applies to you? Obviously, it would be really nice to be able to go through the study, and there are opinions on why projects why projects fail, and they all seem to have merit. I'm not aware of anybody that's really done the rigorous academic study of understanding deeply the predominant drivers of that failure. So that may be interesting. But I think the more relevant question, not having such a study, a rigorous study, is which one applies to you? Because all of us faces different organizational situations, because we all have data in a different place, and because of the complexity of the people involved, the structures of organizations, there's no doubt that each of us faces a predominant reason for why our data science projects fail, more oftentimes than not, more than others. We have specific pieces where we can identify and prioritize out of those those reasons. And as such, there is customization involved. And so I think that it's less about what is the one thing and more about what is the one thing that you're dealing with that is preventing you from having success. And so with that, again, not deep diving into and disentangling the reasons why specific data science problems fail, I figured that I'd talk about the roadmap for what we're doing at Weave, and the philosophical ideas of why I believe that what we're doing is a solution to this problem, and why we are setting ourselves up for data science project success. So with that, I like to start out with the cultural reasons, particularly because there has to be a higher level, in my opinion, there has to be a higher level reason for why we do things in organizations. The why is so important in being able to bring people along, not only in good times, but bad, not only in gaining resources, but also being able to overcome the challenges when things don't work out. The CEO of Microsoft, I love this quote, and I think that this is a big driver of data culture, period. This is actually one of the, I think, first definitions of real definitions and usable definitions of data culture. We believe that with the right tools, insights can come from anyone, anywhere, at any time, he says. When that happens, organizations develop what we describe as a data culture. However, a data culture isn't just about deploying technology alone. It's about changing culture so that every organization, every team, and every individual is empowered to do great things because of the data at their fingertips. This means bringing people together, IT and developers, to create a cultural shift that is just as important as systems and infrastructure. In a data culture, everyone benefits when more people can ask questions and get answers. And in a data culture, the entire effectiveness of an organization can elevate. And I would now kind of bring that into the data science culture as a subset of the data culture. When we think of the why of data science, do we have that higher level thinking of what's just been described here? This idea that it can serve the whole organization instead of just a select few, or those that are most knowledgeable to be able to understand, interpret, and to be able to make decisions. I don't think so. I think that when we limit data science to such a small subset of the population, we really position ourselves for failure. And so this bigger why of data science is really important to be answered. And that's a big part of our strategic plan at Weave with data science and BI, is to really define the why. And it's not something that is done every, in a week or two. What I have found is this is a incremental, one day at a time. It's talking about it in every meeting. It's talking about it at the right times with passion, and being able to nurture specific individuals in what they understand data culture and data science culture to be. And so this is a critical, I believe, a critical important piece of setting ourselves up for success, is being able to help everyone to understand the why and to do it continually and adamantly. So our mission statement, if you will, is to build and sustain a world-class enterprise-grade BI and data science operation at Weave that does four things. First, that it generates revenue, it reduces cost, it increases productivity, and improves the lives of our people. So not only are we focusing a lot on culture, but we're also focusing on impact. In fact, we've coined the term impact, not data. And the reason why we came up with that was because data is a means to an end if it doesn't have an impact. And so that's been a big part of our push since I've been at Weave back in August, in late August, was to stop thinking about what we do as just cleaning up data or creating reports. But it's essentially the lifeblood of creating impact through data. And that without the impact, without these four objectives being hit, that we really try to defer on those projects. Otherwise, I believe that we would just be reporting, or again, in the data science world, it would just be kind of delivering interesting analysis, or creating projects that are, again, just specifically addressing one thing instead of fitting a greater whole. So with that, here's just a few examples one example for each. Generating revenue might be improving the close rate, or reducing costs, reducing the number of support tickets, increasing productivity, automating specific processes like financial processes that have lots of heads assigned to them, or improving the lives of our people through increasing an NPS score. So these are all very specific objectives, and they're simple objectives. They don't need to be complex. In fact, again, going back to the goal of simplicity, simplicity is good and complexity is bad. So one of the things that from this data science piece, and the BI, I believe, is an important entry point to doing effective data science. And as we've positioned data science in our organization, we've used this statement. The critical mistake that the majority of companies make is to watch KPIs or the outcomes, hoping they improve. But we focus obsessively on finding, measuring, and impacting the drivers, the factors of these KPIs to engineer success. And so instead of just hoping through doing very subtle and I would say misguided in some ways hopes, when we bundle different solutions together and don't prove them out, certainly we all would agree that impact cannot be causally, or sometimes, of course, we lean on correlation, but certainly we don't understand what really drives the outcomes when we just watch and see. Ultimately, that becomes an important principle that we have to educate all at the company, even executives who are data minded need to be reminded of this, that finding, measuring, and impacting the drivers is really what you do. That's how you change the performance of a company. And so with that, there are four pillars that we've developed. And again, these are very much in line with what others have said. So this isn't new. It's just packaged maybe in a different way. But we've come with 4 different pillars: quality, simplicity, action, and proof. And this is what basically has driven our roadmap for the next 12 months. When I came in, I got the buy-in from executives on these 4 pillars and the roadmap. And essentially, each quarter we focus on each of these pillars, and we build upon each pillar once they've been completed. So quality was our first pillar at the end of 2019, and that now has different phases all the way through the end of this year, where we have simplicity is what we're working on right now. And then next quarter, we'll work on action, and then proof, which is the operation, where we operationalize the data science pieces of our culture, will happen at the end of this year. So pillar number 1, so ensuring that the data you're using is correct. I want to speak to a few different steps that we've taken to address this. And again, this is framed in why, or more or less the simplicity that's needed. We wanted to distill these pillars into essentials for creating data science success, where we want to be. And certainly we have a lot of things that we still have to do to get there. But in quality, what we found back in August is that there were a number of things that we needed to do to clean up our data and our pipelines. And so in that process, we took 4 steps. First, we documented all of our core data sources. We did not have a good understanding of all of those core data sources. There was a lot of work being done, and there was a lot of data-driven interest. But at the end of the day, there was still a lot of information that was hidden and siloed. And so this started with documenting what all our core data sources were. We ensured that there was ownership over each core data source. So this was also important because being able to maintain good quality meant that somebody needed to own it, own the cleanup, but also own the maintenance. And that there had to be a point person for each person. This is still a process that we're working on, but we have a great deal of understanding now as to who are the owners of each of our core data sources. Step number 3 was establishing connectivity to all the core data sources. So while there's a lot of manual work that we all know that goes into bringing in data to create static models or static information, what we have targeted doing is making sure that we can increase the how dynamic everything is, so that we can reduce manual error and also reduce the requirement for manual data, which can create a lot of issues. And then finally, step 4, we recorded information about each field across core data sources, starting with criticalness, usability, and field definitions. And this is one example. This is what we use. This is the format that we used, where we have just a few fields, but we deployed this out to each of the data source owners and went through all of our fields, reviewed them for first how critical they were. And if they were yes on critical, and what we used was a 10-point scale, and yes on critical was anything 7 to 10 on that, those were prioritized, particularly because there were so many fields. We have so much data and so many fields that we needed to establish first where we were going to start. And so criticality was number 1. And so once we did that, once we created a differentiation between those things that were not critical, the fields that were not critical and those that were, we prioritized those and then started collecting information, and usability became our second measure to understand. And we asked data owners then to rate all of those fields as usable or not. Now, with the usability of that data, what's helpful is now it gave us an opportunity to create 3 different buckets. First, where we had critical, highly usable data, which is our golden data, if you will, the data that we can make decisions from. Phase 2 is working with our critical, non-highly usable data to resolve usability issues and create roadmaps around each of those fields. And of course, that also requires prioritization. But then, of course, this was also just as important, was creating a 3rd bucket, which was addressing all of our non-critical data by encouraging the deletion or the yeah, I mean, the deletion or the or getting rid of all the non-highly usable fields that were not critical, right? So at the end of the day, that is a great deal of the data that we have. And in my experience, that's a great deal of the information that the data that most organizations have is non-critical, non-highly usable fields, which ends up being a tremendous drain and increases data science failure, particularly because the quality of the data can shift beneath your feet. We've experienced that even in our org, but I would imagine that each of you has as well. There's some great work from folks here, even in our valley. You know, Tim Jenkins over at Lucid has done a phenomenal job as one call out in creating a very effective pipelining where they're able to create high quality data source data and then take that through all the way through their data pipelines. But I think that really starts with this. It's being able to identify what even makes it into your data warehouse or data lake, and being able to preserve that and defend it ultimately creates a situation in which you can increase your success on the data quality piece. And without it, you have a lot of struggles to be able to ensure that you don't have that shifting ground. Moving on, I think that purpose, people, and process are really important. And speaking to that, I think back to our vision or our mission statement, and expanding upon it, we do have a statement, a goal statement. It's we believe in the power of data to increase revenue, improve productivity, decrease cost, and improve the lives of our people. We recognize that data is merely a means to an end unless coupled with positive impact. We are deliberate about prioritizing data projects that have the most impact on the bottom line. And so as we focus on that purpose, again, for any project that we undertake, and again, when we talk about the usable and critical data, that then hits on this very objective. And that is the barometer that we use for being able to understand criticality, is what is the value of those fields in being able to hit one of those objectives. And that's where we start. And it doesn't mean that we can't be agile. It doesn't mean that we can't be flexible as the organization changes and the needs change. But at the end of the day, it does give us focus and the ability to say no, or to defer kindly to executives or managers that are asking for specific projects, but they don't really hit the purpose of what we're doing. Moving on to the people piece. So this ends up hitting on data governance. And we created best practices and guidelines across every part of the BI journey. And we'll get to that on the data science journey as well. But we continue to evaluate for weak spots where we can be better. And one of the examples of this was creating basically a best practice and a best practice and guidelines packet, if you will. And we do that on our BI platform. We use Domo. But essentially what we've done is we've deployed out all of our best practices and guidelines across all of our data. And that means connectivity, that means transformation. And it also means visualization. And what we're doing there is essentially having everyone go through and understand and certify them on all of these guidelines and best practices, so that we don't feed bad things into our warehouse, which then helps us on the analysis end to be able to do good, use good hygiene in being able to use our data. And then auditing and certification. So this maybe hits on the process and also ownership. I want to talk about those two things. So with regards to auditing, not only do we have data quality issues when we come in to our data lakes and data warehouses, but then we have to monitor over time and in real time. And so there becomes an importance of creating processes to ensure that data that was once clean, it continues to be clean, and that there's a certification process where, again, there's ownership that is attached to both auditing and certification, just like what we did when we had the data source owner point there. And what we've done to simplify that is just made sure that the owner of data sources are the owners also of the auditing and certification. And that does create quite a bit of lift on their end. But what we found is someone owns that, then it becomes a little bit more challenging for them to say that they can take on all the data and bring in all the data if they're responsible for every single field in that data. Certainly there's a limit to what one can handle. And so there's also ways to automate that process. And there's certainly a lot of tools to do that. But at the end of the day, I think one of the big issues that most have with this is that ownership doesn't necessarily follow that whole chain. And so we've decided to, in the spirit of simplicity, to ensure that the owner is the one that's responsible for connectivity, and is the owner of auditing and certification, and needs to be consulted anytime that a transformation is created with that data source. And in our goal or objective in phase 3, so by the latter half of this year, we hope to have golden data sets, where, again, true source data, where we only have, of course, one data source owner for any type of connection, but that essentially we have golden source data that's been certified that anybody can use with branches of their data that they then can consult the data source owner anytime that a transformation is desired. So from there, let's go to pillar number 2. So this is simplicity, where we tackle one objective at a time in the simplest way possible. Again, on the spirit of simplicity, I want to maybe show a framework of how we believe this should work at Weave. How I believe that simplicity starts with the high level view, and how we can create context through our data science in a way that essentially conveys and gives all the appropriate context that's necessary to executives and management to create operational alignment, but also in a way that frames the solutions that we believe strongly in. So with that, this is one format, and it's a template that we're using at Weave now. Essentially, we've created a template to remove the design barriers. Oftentimes when folks look at data, again, another reason for project failure is that they don't understand it, and it's so hard to communicate it. And so we've started to take out some of the unnecessary burdens caused by different formats and templates. Certainly there's beauty in design, and there is customization that's required for different stories. But what we found is the more that we can remove the uniqueness and customization, the more that you increase the ability for folks to understand the data that they're looking at. And this is particularly important for executives. So we've deployed out this template, which is at the top level is objectives and KPIs, and not too many. Again, there's certainly lots of ideas on this, and many have said 3 to 5 is appropriate for any department, and any more beyond that is unattainable. But when you talk about focus and objectives, this idea of taking in the high level objectives and then creating a specific KPI or key results, but a specific KPI that may be the one that's most important this quarter or this year, and then being able to very quickly see where you're performing against a specific target. So this is one concept, right? And in this, of course, we have the objectives and the key results. And then we also have, status or targets. But the idea of context with data science, and again, this also applies to projects that are not necessarily visualization or analysis, but even development projects. I believe strongly that it starts with the objective, and a very firm objective, something that is clearly understood at the highest level of answering that question of why, and then the key result or the outcome, just like what we were talking about with the mouse and IDEO. They had a very specific challenge that they were trying to solve. It was to build something that was simple, a navigation device, and they had a cost of doing it less than 10% of what was developed on the market. They had a very specific set of key results they had to attain. And of course, for them, whether they did it or not, of course, throughout the project, they were able to develop and they were able to get through their technical issues, but essentially it was a binary for them of did they or didn't they. And then in this framework, what we've done is created where in each of those targets that one can drive into a specific dashboard with a template that extends upon that, where the objective now is more carefully and at a more granular level specified. And these are not complex statements. They're to increase or decrease a specific metric by a certain percentage, by a date, at a specific frequency. And again, there's target versus the current values. And then underneath that is a set of drivers. And this is where data science projects, I think, can really help. And this is where we have a very strong ability to guide an organization, particularly in our ability to communicate simply drivers that are important. And this is maybe follows the 80-20 rule, where you know, if we're able to do simple and fast, that is dependable and strongly correlated, that may be beneficial in moving the organization quickly, than creating a 3-year project, a science project, that may or may not have value. And I can speak to that through my PhD dissertation. You know, after 3.5 years, there are some very complex equations and a lot of analysis. And at the end of the day, I still believe, looking back on that experience, the intuition from the first few days lended itself to probably things that could have moved the industry in venture capital probably just as much if it was deployed at that time than in, you know, that 3.5 year period where we really tried to dig into the theory and created 20 different models to justify whether our theory was right or wrong. Where that initial intuition still was our findings from that drove all of that. And so one could question, was 3.5 years worth it? Certainly in the academic sense, and after publication, you know, you say, okay, the objective was achieved. But from a standpoint of benefiting and impact, one could argue, right? And so the same might be applied in business speak, where if you can create some simple models that can effectively prove themselves as potential drivers. It doesn't mean that they necessarily are the end-all be-all, but if there's belief through some simplistic analysis that can establish whether something's a driver or not, that can be effective in being able to move decisions quickly. So that's a key component of the story as well, is creating context where you've driven from the executive level view down to specific drivers of why or why not, why you have or have not hit your targets. And then finally, being able to communicate all the definitions. A key component of everything that we're visualizing now is this requirement of creating definitions that are unambiguous to all. And that the sources, the definitions, and any notes are then on any single way that we're presenting any type of data science or business intelligence project. This has been important. And what I found in this process is that while you may have the definitions there, there's a lot of education and there's a lot of habit building that you need to have your executives and managers do as you deploy these out, but that people eventually will learn. And they eventually will look for those definitions. And so it is a very meaning, but also very effective way to be able to start communicating data science in a way where people can look at a dashboard or look at a way that you've defined your outcome or even your models, even in the process, where this communication needs to be transparent and it needs to be in a way where it can be standalone. And I think this is one of the challenges that we all face in data science. Is there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of beauty in what we've built, and so we want it to be represented in an effective way. But we also tend to talk about various reasons why or why not something is not 100% aligned with what they might think it is supposed to do. Certainly, all of us have had models that we've built. Or any type of algorithm that we built that we say, hey, there's some caveats here. When we do that, then it starts to muddy the story for somebody who's looking for a very concise explanation of what we've done. And so being able to create standalone, I think, again, goes back to simplicity. It's incredibly important. And it goes back to one of those reasons why data science projects fail. Oftentimes, again, this last mile, in the last mile theory, this has to do with the inability to effectively communicate or give enough confidence to the things that we've built. And in essence, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So then going to pillar number 3. So you know, we've covered the template. We talked about simplicity and ways to communicate simply data science projects, and we talked about also the quality. And I'll quickly go over this action. So the solutions must be actionable. After we've gone through, and again, we're in the phases of going to do this. And so I'll speak to this in theory and how we're road mapping this out. But having worked with large enterprises and C-suites, advising C-suites on BI, that informs this. And I feel like from a standpoint of solutions and how they need to be actionable, after we've gone through that template in any project where we've provided data that can be trusted, and we now have a flow in which we have the executive view, and now we can go to drivers of what's driving performance, this should lead itself then to actionable hypotheses. What we've talked about culturally is the importance of being able to look at data analytically in a way that gets people together in a room. And at a certain point of time, and again, quicker iterations is what we're trying to culturally do. But what we hope for is that this lends itself to more conversations in room with team members that then create hypothesis statements that can be tested, that are actionable. And one example of an actionable visualization is this, right? We know exactly what we're supposed to do by virtue of the data that's being demonstrated there through the visualization. And so there's very clear action when we go to plug in our phone based on a visual that we see on our phone. I think it's one of the most beautiful and effective actionable visualizations that we have in our society, actually. But I think that from a standpoint of how this then converts over to data science projects, we need to be very deliberate if we want success in those projects, to guide our executives, our managers, our organizations to be able to know exactly what are specific things that they can hypothesize on based on the things that we provided. That establishes buy-in from organizational leadership. But then as we really help mold those hypotheses into, well, what are potential actions that are linked to those hypothesis statements that once tested, that they can be implemented across the org. This is incredibly important for the value piece of data science, which is also another failure point for data science projects, is we might, if we hypothesize in a more theoretical sense, may never make the impact on the organization because it never gets adopted. Due to the fact that there's no action that's related. There's nothing that can be done. There's nothing that you can control. So this goes back to being able to measure the drivers and associate specific actions that can be taken from those drivers in moving the X variable instead of just focusing on the Y. This has certainly been validated by many organizations that I've talked to. You know, Uber, talking to friends at Uber, talking to folks across different industries, in various calls with Fortune 250s. This was a tremendous piece of project failure, is the inability to essentially create actionable outcomes. And then finally, I want to focus on proof. So after all of these pillars have been addressed, now we get into kind of the idea of how do we actually get then our data science projects to make it in the organization, and where do we start? And again, I'm going to take a very simple approach here. But the idea of A/B testing is one in which I think is a really good starting point for a lot of immature data science organizations or non-data driven organizations. And so all of that analytics and all of those hypothesis statements that have hopefully surfaced by this point in the organization then lend itself to testing hypotheses on the impact on performance. And so with the data science projects that we have, the goal in Q3 and Q4 of 2020 is essentially to get every single department at Weave to understand what an A/B test is, and essentially to understand baselines and set up their own experiments. I have a vision that every single department can do this, and that if we can essentially push down all of the analytics, all of those that driver data down in a dashboard or whatever reporting format that we use, then what we can do is essentially replace all of that analytics with solutions that we've created and test them against baselines. And that becomes the focal point. I think this addresses one other project failure item. It's this inability to, again, get that buy-in and the convincing aspects of our data science. As we bring people along and as they create solutions that can be tested and they participate in that process, now the science gets combined with real people and the incentives. And as they spend time and they challenge different thoughts and experiment upon them, now this becomes theirs as well. And we become more hand in hand instead of that we're giving information over to people. I think this is very, very critical. And I also feel like for us, incremental improvement and cultural understanding and adoption really comes through with, again, elevating knowledge, but then it's also this actionable where people can see it in real time. And if things aren't working, let's say that your baseline and solution are mirrored, or that you see a insignificant, right? There's no correlation between, or there's no effect on performance when you have a specific solution, then you bring analytics back in and say, well, let's take a look at other drivers. And then that lends itself to another team meeting. And so it's becomes a virtuous cycle in being able to inform how people use data science actively in their products or in their marketing or how they make decisions. And so that is a really big target for us this year, is to ensure that every single team can basically do an A/B test, and that we set something up there through their departments. So at the end of this, you know, we're getting to the last couple of slides here. I just want to say a couple of thoughts on impact. You know, this idea of measuring impact is also very critical. The ability to ask the question, and we've asked this question every time we've completed a data science project now, is how much time did that save you, or how much money did that result in? And we can, of course, measure those things, and we set that up at the onset of any project now. But at the end, we also do our debrief, and we ask those questions now to quantify, and we represent and communicate that to the organization. So that way we can validate more and more of the data science function. So each project, successful project, can feed in to more resource and more validity. Another concept with impact to me is this statement of one column at a time. I really believe that data science, again, in its most simple form, is basically solving one column at a time. It's this idea that if you do data science correctly, then there is an output. And in that output, it's basically one column of data. Now, obviously, we can get much more complex with that. But the fundamental idea here is that Y variable is what we're after. And if we have the ability to communicate that we're basically solving one column at a time, this does simplify the understanding of impact. And it's a really good exercise to go through. Next is delta, this idea of delta. And if I'm going to write a book someday, which I hope to, it will be called Managing Delta. And the reason why is because, going back to that Y versus X, the delta of the X is what you care about. That's the things that you can control. And oftentimes, I think that one of the things that I've witnessed is the inability to clearly articulate incremental delta from the projects that we do in data science. And the more that we can focus on communicating that delta and helping helping executives and managers understand delta, like what is the delta, instead of looking at this of where we want to be in a specific improve or accuracy, it's really focusing on the improvement. And as we can help folks understand that while we may have error or we might have bias, if there's improvement, then we can address perhaps what are the sources of error, and we can address all of those things. But the improvement will allow us to then have project success, I think, a lot more than if we try to do this as to where we want to be on a Y variable basis. And that will improve the success of our projects. And then finally, I think this is just kind of a last slide, but this is something I've been thinking about the last few months is, are we not, as data scientists and developers of important machine learning and AI advances, aren't we just like speechwriters to perhaps the presidents of the United States, right? Like, as one example. I love this concept of being the speechwriter, particularly because I don't view a speechwriter as necessarily being the person that just puts words to a page. Obviously, they try to go in the style of who is delivering the address. But I think that speechwriters have a great deal of influence over millions of people, particularly in that realm. And the reason why is because these ideas, the way that they put thoughts together on the page, these words are things that can capture hearts and minds. And oftentimes I've thought of, you know, if reporting is or analysis is the end all be all, that seems very uninspiring. But I've started to think more of data science and BI as being more the person that's really winning over hearts and minds. And maybe there's other people that are communicating those ideas. Maybe there's people that are capturing those hearts and minds through the way that they communicate, the way that they're able to relate, and all of those things. But at the end of the day, if we approach the things that we build and we have conviction around those, I think that we can move our organizations tremendously, and we can really do that in a way that maybe isn't the person that's delivering the address, but we have a lot of power, and so we should have conviction in the things that we do, and I think that will ultimately increase the success that we have in our data science projects as well. So with that, I'm going to end and certainly can turn time to any questions that anybody might have on the framework or any other concepts, but appreciate your time, and hopefully this presentation has been useful.
Okay. We give Carlos a virtual round of applause because that's hard to do. Not sitting around, not in person. I want to put my camera back on. So I don't have any questions in Slack. And I don't see anything in the meetup chat anyway, which means that Carlos was ridiculously amazing. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? I'm going once, going twice. Okay, cool. Thanks everybody for participating. If you have any feedback for our virtual meetups, please post it in the Forge Slack and the live meetup channel so that we can iterate on this. We want to accommodate as many meetups as possible virtually, as we are all working remote and trying to best weather the unfortunate circumstances where we can't get together and have a more conversive environment. I'm gonna leave this call going for a while, so if you guys want to unmute and chat, feel free to hang out as long as you want, and then when everyone goes, I will end it. Just let me stop that recording. Okay, the recording is now